Hi, I'm Grady Collane, and welcome to Sunday Journal. I'm joined today by a special guest from Mass Audubon. Do you mind introducing yourself for our listeners?
Yes, my name is Lyra Brennan, and I'm the director of Mass Audubon's Coastal Waterbird Program.
All right, awesome. Thank you for joining me in the studio today to have this conversation.
My pleasure.
So we want to talk about one of Massachusetts' favorite birds, the Piping Plover. And even before we got on the microphone, we wanted to talk about the successes of this program in terms of helping out this. It was endangered, I believe, for a long time. It still is.
It is on the endangered species list, both the state and federal, but it's classified as threatened on those lists.
Okay. But while we were having conversations leading up to this, immediately we were met with, is it plover or is it plover? And right now, while we have the expert, I wanted to get the official execution on that one. So can you let us know?
Yes, that's fair. It is pronounced both ways, and as far as I know, both ways are considered correct. I tell folks to choose whichever one they like. I was taught plover, so I say piping plover. People all across the Atlantic coast say plover, plover. Plover is more common in Massachusetts, so you make your own decision there.
All right, I wanted to get that out of the way earlier in this segment before we had people calling in, just to help correct the situation. But it's a rousing success, it seems, this year for helping out piping plovers across the beaches of Massachusetts. Do you mind talking more about what Mass Audubon does every year for these animals and how this season was a little bit more positive?
Yeah, it was an amazing season for the Coastal Waterbird Program, and we are a statewide program, so we work all the way up on the North Shore, the islands, Cape Cod, South Coast, you name it. We bring on almost 40 seasonal staff, so young folks just starting out their career in science or conservation, and we're out on the beaches protecting nests with fencing, providing education, sharing information with folks, and really actively protecting a rare species on our beaches.
Mm-hmm. That is awesome. So how long have you guys been doing this for, essentially? When did the piping plover become endangered, threatened? And how long do you anticipate that we might continue to see some of these efforts ongoing? Is this something for years? Are we doing better? Where are we now?
Great question. So the plover was listed in 1986, which is when the Coastal Waterbird Program was started. So we really kind of started right when the worries about this bird came to light. There were only about 135 pairs left in the state, so and really relatively that's not a lot. We have come an incredibly long way. Basically what we're doing is working, and it's working really well. But it's hard to say what the future looks like for the species. You know, really the folks in charge here are the state and federal wildlife regulators. And so they make the decisions about listing species, delisting species, and we have to remember that these birds are really conservation dependent. They need our help on the beaches because you can imagine if we pulled all of the fencing, everything was gone, and there are hundreds, thousands of nests on the beach, there's no protection, you can see how things would drop again really, really quickly. So it's a good question.
Mm-hmm. So for just for those who may not be fully familiar, what are some of the biggest obstacles for these small, very delicate creatures? What was some of the causes of their rapidly dwindling population to begin with? And have things changed? Are there new obstacles or new challenges? Just what are some of the major obstacles for them?
Well, when they first were listed, there was a lot of really aggressive beach development. So the ecosystem was changing really fast. There was a lot of driving, vehicle use, really fun activities having out on the beach that unknowingly really was contributing to the decline. Nowadays, you know, some of those have been addressed. Just more of those activities are regulated. There's more rules in place. You can't go out right now and build a house right on the beach today. You need to go through a permitting process. So I think that's part of it. And nowadays, some of those challenges remain. There's just a lot of disturbance on the beach. There are a lot of predators that are very excited about beach nesting birds, and dogs, even though we love dogs, dogs that aren't necessarily following the rules of the beach can, again, unintentionally injure or kill listed species. So those are just a handful of the things that they have stacked against them. I will also throw out this, even though folks might have strong feelings about it, sea level rise, climate change, these habitats are changing really, really rapidly, and so that's another big concern.
Mm-hmm. I do love my dog as well, but they are unfortunately snack-sized by comparison.
Exactly.
It's very unfortunate. So as well, it's a bit of a love-hate relationship that some people have with these shorebirds because they do lead to a lot of beach closures when it comes to oversand vehicles and whatnot. Can you comment on how that impacts the lives of these small creatures, and is that important, essentially? Do you think that we're going to continue doing that for a time?
I think so, because any listed species, the regulatory organizations are going to take steps to protect them. ultimately, I think now we're doing a fantastic job. I think that Mass Audubon, from our perspective, there has to be some kind of balance, right? Because we all love the beach. I grew up in Massachusetts. I grew up going to the beach in Massachusetts. And so it's really, really important that folks still get to enjoy the beach, be out on the beach. Mass Audubon doesn't close beaches to everybody. So there are some spots, actually in the United States where just the whole beach is closed, no pedestrians, no driving. But I think that now the limitations on driving have come a long way, and that's because the chicks are, as you said, snack-sized. They're the size of cotton balls, basically, on toothpicks, running around. They need to feed themselves as soon as they hatch, and they're so vulnerable to vehicles, right? They're going to crouch in vehicle tracks, and right away you can undo a full month of a very brave plover parent incubating with one vehicle. So it's a tricky situation out there.
Mm-hmm. Now with I'm sure this is true across a lot of Massachusetts, but Cape Cod is so water dependent when it comes to its tourism economy. We sell essentially our beachfront for people to enjoy. So do you have a little bit more trouble around here when it comes to balancing whether or not, like how much versus how little? How does conservation kind of intersect with the economy? Is it a little bit more of a challenge? Is there headbutting that goes on, or?
I wouldn't say so. We take an incredible amount of data down every year, and ultimately about 95 to 98% of the conversations we have, folks are positive. They're interested, they get it, or they just really don't care. They're used to it. There's some fencing on the beach. It's not their favorite thing, but people are still able to access and enjoy the beach. If you go to any of the most popular beaches on Cape Cod, Seagull Beach in Yarmouth, down right at Craigville, all these places, there's so much space on the beach. Same thing with the National Seashore. We don't work out on the National Seashore. That's all National Park Service, but there's an incredible amount of space. So we actually don't run into more challenges on that front in Cape Cod than we do anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. That is excellent. I'd love to know more about the community outreach that essentially goes through. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has all these questions for you throughout the given year. How much of the time is spent essentially advocating for piping plovers and other animals that need conservation?
An incredible amount of time. I mean, I would say we're doing a lot of wildlife management on the ground, but we are talking to thousands and thousands of people on the beach. All of our staff are trained to be educators as well, and Mass Audubon has an amazing education department and program. We've got preschools, we've got adult programs. So Mass Audubon happens to be really, really good at that. And what we try to focus on is meeting people where they are, understanding that we all have really incredible love affairs with the beach. And so understanding other folks' point of view is an important part of that process. If people really don't like the birds, that's totally okay. And our goal is to really find common ground and connect, even if that means that someone isn't feeling super pleased with the plovers.
Understandable. There. So you mentioned this is part of a bird. Is this a general, like, multiple birds or under this subset? You kind of mentioned it as if it was multiple seabirds. So there are other things besides plovers that you're looking out for on the Cape Cod region? There
are. So terns. We protect least terns, which are a small seabird. They have a yellow beak. They're a little bit hard to differentiate between other terns, such as common terns, or roseate terns, which are a federally endangered species. So we protect all of these species. They are all listed under the state Endangered Species Act, and in the roseate terns case, federal. And we also protect American oyster catchers, which you may or may not be familiar with. If you're not, you should Google them. They're an incredibly cool-looking bird. They have a lot of character. They're sort of like our version of penguins. They're black and white and have really, really long red beaks, and they often co-nest alongside piping plovers.
Mm-hmm. Now, this would be completely impossible, but someday I'd love to have a couple of birds in the studio to kind of take pictures of and enjoy in front of the camera. But unfortunately, the local wildlife needs to be quite well protected, despite my love for some of the local avian creatures, well known for people who are familiar with this show. So is there anything else that is involved in the process for Mass Audubon right now? I know every year there's the turtle stranding season, essentially. I know your focus is birds. But did you want to highlight some of the other general conservation goals of the Mass Audubon while you're here?
Absolutely. I mean, the work that Mass Audubon does, we are just one part of it. We're one part that I feel deeply excited about. But as you said, sea turtle strandings, those are all critically endangered sea turtles. They're working with diamondback terrapin, which are another listed species. Over at Long Pasture in Barnstable, there's a spadefoot toad project. Shocker, that's another listed species. All over the state, Mass Audubon is protecting all different kinds of species, right? It's not just birds. We also have lots of different partnerships. Some are the international partnerships with other states to protect all kinds of wildlife and ecosystems, right? So it's not just about the wildlife. There's cranberry bog restoration, there's salt marsh restoration, you name it. So I'm not an expert in all of those, but all of those are related because it's, every single part of our Cape Cod ecosystem is connected. And if you lose one part, that's going to impact the other part, as we've all sort of learned with big storms.
Actually, that was my next question, is as we've been seeing larger and more powerful storms, a lot of towns are concerned with erosion currently. We have dredging programs at Barnstable County, which are a big help, but all of that is involving a very obviously changing shoreline. How does stuff like that impact some of your conservation efforts, specifically just the storms and especially with sea level rise and strengthening storms with climate change?
There's sort of two sides to it. Piping plovers evolved with storms and really dynamic coastal ecosystems. So if a big storm comes through over the winter and opens up a nice overwash sandy area, that's a plover hotel. They love it. But over time, if we start looking at net habitat loss, that's when there's going to be less places for these birds to nest. They're going to be less successful. And really, sometimes they'll come back to the beach that they usually nest at, and there's no habitat left. So there's a lot of concern about the future for these species. Right now, they're doing well. Is that sustainable with habitat loss? It's hard to say, and we're doing a lot of really great research projects to understand what that's going to look like. We are advocating very strongly for coastal restoration and dredging. So the Coastal Waterbird Program and Mass Audubon across the board. We love the county dredge, if you're listening. We love the folks over there. We work with them really closely to both build habitat for birds and coastal resiliency.
That is really interesting. So I think, myself included, a lot of people might assume that dredging and other ways that humans interact with the environment in a very large-scale movement of sand and whatnot can be destructive. But you're saying that's actually a very helpful process for some of these creatures.
Yes, it has to happen outside what we call the time of year restriction. So it has to happen before or after piping plovers arrive and nest. So they're not dumping sand on top of nesting birds. But again, this is a species that loves those wide open sandy areas, maybe some sparse vegetation. And so those changes, especially when we live in a heavily, heavily engineered coastline, we've got all kinds of groins and jetties and hardscaping. So the natural system is already out of whack, right? We're already going to see erosion even without climate change. We'd see sand-starved areas, like the town of Sandwich is a great example. The Cape Cod Canal, that jetty there is literally blocking sand, and they need sand to build up the beach in a natural way. So when we do that, we're serving wildlife. I mean, and people, but we are helping protect wildlife as well.
That is awesome. I'm sure our friends at the Barnstable County Dredge Program listening in are definitely appreciative of that.
They're the best, yeah.
That is good to know. So, as well, other man-made things that we know, like crows are very easily can fit in with human society, essentially. But when it comes to these beachfront properties, it doesn't seem like that it works at all the same for some of these seafaring birds. Are there ways that humans can maybe develop in ways that are a little bit more friendly to them? Like, can they benefit from the shade of docks, or do they have the ability to nest? For example, the hardscape that you mentioned before, those are just a no-go for any of these creatures?
That'll be a no-go. They really want that sandy habitat. I always say they want to be right where you want to put your beach chair or your towel. That is prime nesting habitat for piping plovers. These days with development and anything that happens in this kind of mapped habitat, which is what the state calls it, where listed species are nesting or using, you have to go through an extensive permitting process to build. And that's because anything you do may or may not impact the birds, but the state's got it down to a science, and they've made it so plover monitoring is a part of that work, or the decisions you make building a fence, as you said, or a dock or something like that isn't having a negative impact on the birds.
All right, awesome. So as well, is there any other initiatives that you wanted to highlight for us while you're here related to not just the piping plovers, but some of the other efforts that Mass Audubon is undertaking? We already mentioned the turtle programs as well, but you guys offer a lot of conservation and education. Do you want to highlight some of those for us?
I would say, the biggest thing I would say is get to our sanctuaries or properties if you haven't been there. There's so much going on. I couldn't list it all. We have so many sanctuaries across the state, and on Cape Cod in particular. And this stuff is all online too, all the different programs. So if you have an interest, you'd be surprised. There's probably something there that aligns with what you're interested in. And there's a lot of experts at Mass Audubon. Clearly, shorebirds and seabirds are my area of expertise, but everything from policy to marketing to communications to different conservation initiatives, it's all there. So, and they're also really beautiful places. I don't know if you've been out to Wellfleet or Tidmarsh in Plymouth, or what are some of the other great ones? Ashumet over in Falmouth. So I would just encourage people to get out there. There's a lot to see.
That is awesome. We're about coming up on time, but as well I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about vegetation. Specific to birds, I'd seen some articles lately highlighting the importance of some of the taller natural American grasses when it comes to foliage for birds to hide in and whatnot. And I recently found out that we also have a few invasive species of vegetation on Cape Cod, things like burning bushes and whatnot. Do you guys make efforts when it comes to local planting or outreach to gardeners, essentially, on how maybe they can be assisting? Or how does that impact any of the shorebirds?
Outreach to local gardeners, I'm not sure if Mass Audubon does that, but I know that APCC does a lot of really great work with native plantings, so I would encourage folks to check them out. In terms of invasive plants in the dunes, it's interesting. What happens sometimes is if there's enough invasive plants growing in the dune, it will be so dense that there's no place for something like an American oyster catcher to nest. So it's something that we're aware of, and in some cases we're able to do vegetation management projects. Again, that's all permitted by the state. We can't go out willy-nilly and pull things up, but there are some great opportunities to really do that, because invasive plants for the most part aren't really helping anything at all. They're not what we want growing in our wild habitats. We really want the native species, especially in places like salt marshes. I mean, it's really critical that those ecosystems have the ability to be biodiverse and aren't fully taken over by something scary like burning bush, which wouldn't grow in a salt marsh, but burning bush is scary. On another note, unrelated note.
On an unrelated note, you keep the secret to yourself. Of course, we're not on air right now or anything. But I had been made aware because we had a burning bush at our old property for the longest time, and completely unaware there was actually an invasive species, as it turns out. So if you're listening out there and you have a burning bush, unfortunately,
get rid of it.
You might want to get rid of it.
It's not helping plants. It's not helping any wildlife because they're poisonous.
Very unfortunate.
Go figure.
Well, thank you so much for the extra knowledge. Is there, while I still have you, I'd love to know, how did you get involved with Mass Audubon? Do you have a success story to share with us before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, like I said, I grew up coming to Cape Cod, Plymouth, used to go to Revere Beach all the time as a kid, never saw these birds, didn't have any idea they existed. Years and years ago, after I did my undergraduate degree, I started feeling really worried about the world, right? I started just worrying about our wildlife, worried about conservation. And my first job in conservation was working as a shorebird monitor for the Coastal Waterbird Program. And I just couldn't believe that this whole time, here I was, looking for wildlife, looking for these wild places, and the whole time that I was on the beaches in Massachusetts, I was in a place where there could be a listed species hanging out. So I fell in love with the birds, but more so the people. I mean, the people that do kinds of conservation work that Mass Audubon does are so dedicated and are really trying to make the world a better place. And that means working with local communities too. So I think that we feel really lucky to be in Cape Cod, just in general.
All right, awesome. For those who want to help out, are you taking opportunities for volunteers or even things like donations? How does Mass Audubon, if someone's in the community and wants to assist in the mission, how can they help out?
I would say check out the website. There's plenty of volunteer opportunities on there, and there's also more information about things, different donations that we might accept. Maybe you have equipment that you don't use anymore, things like that. We are a nonprofit, so every little bit helps, and there's a lot of good information there on the Mass Audubon website.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I really appreciate it. Any last comments before we wrap up?
No, just I want to thank you. I really love, if you can't tell, love talking about these birds. And again, this is a really special place to live and work. So, and I'm also psyched to be on the radio, because I listen to the radio every day. So that's pretty exciting too.
Well, welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you. Hopefully we'll have you back soon to talk more about some of the other initiatives going on, perhaps again for the turtle stranding season once that officially kicks off. I know you're more birds, but we'd love to have your voice again.
Absolutely. That would be great.
All right. I'm Grady Collane in the CapeCod.com News Center, and this has been Sunday Journal.